What exactly is theurgy? We hear it talked about a lot in occult, mystical, and magical spaces. However, there is a lot of misinformation on exactly what this thing is. We have scholars that talk about it from an academic level, and we have a lot of occultists that talk about it from a little bit of a misinformed position. This week on Discourse, we interview and speak to an expert on the matter, a YouTuber that goes by the name Abbas the Alchemist. I'm really excited to bring you this guest in this episode, as this practitioner has influenced and informed a lot of my own personal practice. So let's dive into the divine art of theurgy, what exactly it is, a little bit of the historical context, and then Abbas is going to provide us a little bit of his personal experience as a practitioner. Three, two, one. All right, welcome back to Discourse. This is Abbas the Great, joined as always by Dr. Anna Stone.
Hi.
And this week we are interviewing a special guest. His name is Abbas the Alchemist on YouTube, and he is a YouTube channel that I absolutely love. I've been listening to him for a few years. Doesn't have as much subscribers as I think he should have, because I absolutely love his channel. I'm constantly getting like new books to read, deep cuts on academics. It's like I have to keep replaying the video and like trying to figure out what like Islamic scholar he has said and like writing it down. Yeah, I love it. It's really inspiring channel, and so I'm glad to have you here, Abbas, as I think there's a lot of misinformation on theurgy, and you focus a lot on your YouTube channel on theurgy. And what I like about your channel is that the theurgy is not only well educated and scholarly, but it's from a practitioner's perspective as well, which is really hard to find.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, yes. That's wonderful.
Yeah. It is great. So we actually haven't discussed theurgy on our channel yet. Might be weird from somebody running around calling themselves Abamon.
Yeah.
But I would love it if you filled in our audience on like what exactly is theurgy, because in occultism, we hear it a lot, but a lot of people, they'll say that it's like, if you conjure angels, you're doing theurgy, which really isn't kind of the case. So like, let's get a groundwork for what exactly theurgy is from the expert himself.
Yes.
Oh, expert, my goodness. Wow, thank you. Well, first off, thank you for the invitation. And it's not something I'm used to. I haven't really done too many interviews, but the ones that I have been enjoyable. And thank you again for inviting me into your home, even though it's virtually. But let's use our imagination here. But yeah, theurgy is, I guess you could kind of like distinguish it somewhat from thaumaturgy, which would be an idea of wonder working. But theurgy is really divine working. It's being worked upon by the gods. And so it's essentially, you can kind of isolate it to a late antique ritualistic practice that emerged from classical Platonism. And it had it's very interesting. It had the Neoplatonists, again, that's a very scholarly term. They wouldn't have considered themselves Neoplatonists, but the one that kind of revivified Plato in many ways was Plotinus. And Plotinus was, I wouldn't say, he wasn't exactly anti-ritual, but he was very much deeply philosophical and contemplative of a thinker. He was very intellectual. And so there was a notion of intellectual mysticism that comes about from Plotinus. And as you move through the different thinkers and Neoplatonists, you would come up with Porphyry, who kind of compiled all the teachings of Plotinus in the Enneads. And then from Porphyry, you have an interesting pupil-teacher relationship with Iamblichus. And Iamblichou is Iamblichum in Syrian. It would be a notion of may he rule, is essentially this idea. He came from an Emessin sort of aristocratic lineage. And so Iamblichus would be the Neoplatonist who kind of formulated this theurgic approach to communing with the gods, working with the gods, and in contradistinction to Plotinus, which was more theoretical contemplative. And again, we later have Proclus, who develops a lot of the ideas of Iamblichus, and of course his teacher Syrianus. So as you move through the sort of Platonic academy, especially in the later Neoplatonists, theurgy becomes a much more, Iamblichian theurgy becomes much more of an accepted praxis, let's say, over and above maybe Platinian notions of metaphysics. So in this regard, theurgy, especially from the Iamblichian perspective, is an interesting syncretism of Hellenic, Egyptian, and Chaldean traditions. And, we have notable Emperor Julian II, who was a self-proclaimed theurgist. He was initiated into the mysteries of, there was a temple of Hecate that he was initiated into, and he was a follower of this tradition. And I believe there was a sense in which he wanted to reintegrate that into the Roman sort of Roman Empire when Christianity had already had a stronghold. And it's we can definitely go deeper into theurgy, but on the superficial level, on the most immediate level, it's an understanding of working, having the gods work upon you, but also not pulling them down. And this is one of the things that they distinguish from the Goes, or Goetia, which is this idea of like magic as a dark and sinister path of kind of manipulation and coercion. They like to differentiate themselves in saying that the gods are not to be compelled to do the workings of the magician. But, of course, these are fundamental differences, but in many ways there is an overlap between magic and magical practice, and the theurgist could easily be called a magician of sorts. Of course, the fine-tuning and the fine-tooth comb of differentiation would show that there's a huge gap between the two in terms of the manner in which they do it. But many things like prayer would be the same. So the magician would pray to the gods in the same way, in the same manner, oftentimes as a theurgist. I think the change would be in some of the rituals, but even then, it's not so cut and dry. So yeah, that's the introduction that I would propose.
I mean, I love it.
Yeah. I mean, I have a question.
Of course.
So what is it more like then for theurgy? It's you're making yourself more attractive to the gods so that they will want to help you, as opposed to with ritual magic where you're commanding. So it's like it would be more of an honor then in a theurgist viewpoint.
Yeah,
to have that work.
Absolutely. Exactly as you say, Iamblichus would talk about epididaiotes, which is this idea of fittedness, allowing yourself, or oh no, he disappeared.
Yeah, sorry, just a second.
No.
Sorry.
It's
okay.
It's a fitness. It's a certain fitness to receive the divine energy. Again, it's a part of it's a form of harmonization, allowing yourself to you're working on yourself in many ways, but you're also purifying yourself, and you're allowing the movements of your soul to echo those of the gods, because there's a particular type of movement, there's a particular type of kinesis that the gods engage in, and for the theurgist to actually emulate that, that's one of the keys to ascent, or anagoge, or epistrophe, however you want to use the term. But yeah, you're right. It's an attunement. That's in one way I can imagine it. Imagine you have a stringed lyre, and you have sort of you have your eighth note. You have your whole one string on the first string when you pluck it, and the eighth string it's supposed to resonate. And so when you have a harmonization and you have a resonance, that's kind of the best physical analogy you can have for a theurgist who is attuning themselves to the divine.
Oh, I like that so much. That's great. Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
perfect sense to me.
I'm trying to remember.
Yeah.
I used to play guitar and and piano, and it's been such a long time since I've picked up either instrument. And I'm trying to remember. I think it's 8 notes. I think it's like each whole note, and then by the time you reach the eighth, it's
It's 8, yeah.
yeah,
For an
you're back.
octave.
Yeah, an
That's 8.
octave. So you go from E to E. So on a higher register. That's precisely right. Yeah, there we go.
Yes.
Thanks, Abamon. I
Exactly.
really appreciate
Yeah.
the reminder.
I was thinking about violin too, and then you said 8th string.
I think most of us come from music. You
Yes.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. There's an Apollonian aspect to that for sure, right? So
Yes. Yeah.
yeah. And so again, with theurgy, there are different. I mean, like what I want to emphasize is that there are different traditions in a way, but they're all within one tradition. There are different, maybe not different traditions. Maybe that's not the right way of describing it. There are different emphases. So some would emphasize certain aspects, for example, as opposed to others. For example, Iamblichus, his idea is that the soul, in the mysterious, he would believe that the soul actually is fully descended in embodiment. Whereas Plotinus and maybe even Porphyry would suggest that there's a part of the soul that remains up in the intelligible realm. So in that regard, and I made a video about this regarding sort of the mirror of Dionysus and how Plotinus, interpreted in a certain way. There is a metaphysical complexity there that I'm not sure we can land 100% in either camp. I think Iamblichus absolutely has a point, but Plotinus also has an interesting perspective based on his metaphysics. In his regard, Plotinus, is like the soul doesn't really descend as a thing that descends through the planetary spheres. It's like an extension. It's like the soul extends itself in space. And it's a very nuanced way, but when the vehicle descends, it doesn't descend as a whole in a sense. It's really just like a string that is made taut and pulled all the way down to the sort of the material realm. And so in that way, space is created in that descent. So he has a very unique notion of space itself. And based on that, there's an element in which you can say, their metaphysics are slightly different. So that accounts for this idea of the descended versus undescended. But philosophically as well, you can see that they both have a point. So, yeah. But I prefer the Iamblichian, of course.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, that's quite interesting. I feel like I know what that's about.
Yes, I know. She had a near-death experience that she...
Like I died in 2016 in the hospital. For 6 minutes, I actually saw myself up. I'm fine. I'm here.
Oh, yes.
But
wow.
I went up and met up. I say up. I don't know where it was. And met myself. And it was a different version of myself.
Wow.
But it was me somehow. And I was very aware of that. But we were definitely connected. And so that idea, that part of it's still up. And then the other part's descended. To me, I experienced that. So that's crazy to hear that.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, I really hate the term perennialist, but it's really difficult for me to look at these different traditions and not see the similarities. When you're talking about what Plotinus is talking about, how the soul is kind of expanding out, and you're talking like that happens within the Tibetan tradition, and what theurgy has always kind of looked like to me is kind of those initiations and those assumptions that they take in Tantra and that kind of thing. And then when you're talking about the descension of the vehicle in theurgy, that's very similar to the Merkava in Jewish mysticism, right? And there's a lot of similarities here. And I know that on your channel, you go a lot into Arabic alchemy. And so I'm wondering, what is the relationship between the Arabic alchemy and theurgy? Is the Arabic alchemist that's performing conjunction with Allah, right? Is undergoing the same process as the Greek theurgist, as the tantric practitioner, as the Merkava mystic. Are these all kind of the same process with different metaphysical scaffolding, or
cultural scaffolding? Yeah.
What an enormous question.
I know.
Yeah. Yeah. So to your first point about the perennialists, I used to be a perennialist before it became somewhat fashionable. There was a great website called Sacred Web, and they would have articles by very famous traditionalists and perennialists, like contemporary thinkers. But of course, they would also make reference to Ananda Kumaraswamy, René Guénon, Frithjof Schuon. So a lot of these very well-known perennialist traditionalist school. And and this Aldous Huxley as well. Didn't he also write? He also write like
he was a
perennialist.
Yeah.
Yeah, he has a very very interesting brother as well, who's I think a eugenicist. I think there was some very very strange,
fashionable.
very strange ideas flowing through that. But I would suppose I used to be a perennialist, and I no longer am. I think they have a point in the sense that there is a level of universalizability to all the diverse traditions and the religions. And especially with the practices. So it's almost like a science. It's a science of praxis. There's an art and a science in which many different ways of manipulating the body, manipulating the breath, working with the material world, understanding these different cosmic entities. I think there's a yoga, body positions. I think there's a way in which there's a universal science of that. And in that regard, we can do a sort of a comparative religion analysis. We can say, oh, this is like this and this is like that. And, this God is like that God. I think when it gets a little bit, unsophisticated, is when people are starting to equate them one with another. Like Shiva is Dionysus and Dionysus is Jesus. And, and I think there's a great danger in that, because that essentially condenses and collapses the divine into one. And if you really take Iamblichus, or even what Socrates says in the Cratylus, and even with Proclus, you understand that there's an importance of divine names. And this is what I find very intriguing about sort of the Henry Corbin was a famous French philosopher, and he was a historian as well, and he researched Suhrawardi and Ibn Arabi, and so the Islamic esoteric tradition. And what you find in these divine names is something that still operates within a monotheistic metaphysical framework, but it does it in such a subtle way that it's able to balance, especially with Ibn Arabi, it's able to balance a polytheistic sort of understanding with an allegedly monotheistic God. Of course, it doesn't go wholly there, because he has to, of course, maintain that the monotheistic element there. But there is a way in which the divine names can function as these intermediary gods. And in many ways, it's like there's a type of metaphysical system where you see, all the different gods and in different traditions are just simply aspects of the one God that is supreme among all of them. And I think that's one I don't subscribe to. And I think the perennialists, in whatever sort of way of describing their understanding of perennialism, I think they would subscribe to something like that, a universalizing tendency that goes all the way up to the one itself, and then identifies some sort of cosmic being or some supremum, uns supremum, that somehow is the source of all things and all gods and all traditions and all peoples. And I don't see it quite that way. And I actually think the works of Proclus, and if you can even go further back, you can see elements of this. It's what Edward Butler calls like henodology, which is essentially a study of units and units and unicity and what makes something one. Anyway, we don't have to dive too deep into that metaphysic, but to me, my critique of the perennialists is precisely on that front, that they sometimes break too much of the nuance and the subtleties of what makes a tradition unique, and it tries to fit into a mold, a preconceived mold that ultimately derives from a monotheistic Abrahamic faith. And yeah, you see that also in some of the Hindu traditions. Sort of Vedanta does the same metaphysical move where they collapse things into a unity, and other things become aspects. So yeah, that's my little beef, I suppose, with perennialism.
No, it's great. Yeah. It's a great way to put it. I think that's the one of the best critiques on what's wrong with perennialism. They said a lot. I think the last time I wrote about perennialism, it sounded like a enraged 13-year-old, and I was like, I can't let anybody see that. Like, this is so unsophisticated.
That's fantastic.
But yeah, no, I love that. That was great. A great explanation. So I think what I'm really interested, you talk a lot about the theurgy on your channel, but I think some of the real gold is your insight into the Arabic and Islamic esotericism. I'm wondering how that fits into your personal practice, your daily practice, and your predisposition for Greek, high Greek paganry, I guess, if you would call it that.
Yeah. Interesting question. Yeah, I think it really goes back that my interest in sort of the Arabic alchemy ultimately derives from a work by Peter Kingsley, and I really value the scholarship of Peter Kingsley. And an interesting story. So this is back in the day when I was a perennialist, and randomly in my my cart in Amazon, I saw this book constantly being recommended. It was The Reality by Peter Kingsley. And at this point, I'd read the Greek philosophers, and I had read as many of the traditionalists, that I could come across. And I felt nervous. I felt intimidated by the book. And I had just read the abstract, and it wasn't even something, it wasn't anything in particular that he was saying in this synopsis of the book, but I felt deep down inside that this would be earth-shattering for me. This would unseat me from my strongly held beliefs. And I think, as a side note, as a perennialist, this is the pitfall I encountered. This is the issue. You start to see, you aim for the sacred, and you start to view everything in modernity as almost a total inversion of the sacred, and there's an absolute critique there, absolutely true. But then it's your reaction to it. You start to hate it, you start to dismiss it. Everything that doesn't conform to a rigid, dogmatic expression of what the quote unquote perennialist truth is, the sacred kingship and sort of the quality versus quantity understanding, and all of those things are legitimate in its own way, but it doesn't allow for flexibility that is conducive to nature as such. It's too, if I may use that word, too intellectualized. It's too abstracted. It becomes a system unto itself, and it becomes by that token, it becomes a monster. And anything that doesn't conform to it, you reject, or you criticize, or you lash out at. And this is what happened when I was about to approach the book by Kingsley, and I read it, and it was about Parmenides and Empedocles and the mystical tradition that lay behind them. and the message that they were conveying. And it opened me up to reality, absolutely and fundamentally, to my very core. And I went down this path, and I realized that through that Arabic alchemy and Sufism, tasawwuf, these are things that Empedocles himself, they've adapted ideas and the mystical tradition from Empedocles as well. And he runs as innervating spirit behind so much of those practices. And to me, it was that mystical experience of actually engaging in those very esoteric practices that Empedocles only hints at in his poems, that really I sought out, how do I elucidate this? How do I recover some more of these practices and make them articulate? And that took me down the pathway of sort of the Arabic alchemists as well. And I guess what Kingsley ultimately does, and this is very strange coming from a Neoplatonist or someone who considers himself a theurgist, is that he's deeply critical of Plato. He sees Plato as, and this is like, there's an academic streak, and there's a legitimate claim, perhaps you can say. Some are defenders of Plato. But from Kingsley's perspective, Plato was the beginning of the end. He took a magical tradition that Empedocles and Parmenides was part of, and he intellectualized it, and he codified it, and he put it into a system of Plato's own making. And in that way, he inverted and he changed the meaning of original ideas of Parmenides and Empedocles and adapted it to suit his own purposes and his own agendas. And from that, you get Aristotle, who even does a further systematizing and maybe even concretizing it. But what Kingsley recognized was that Iamblichus especially, he held in high esteem because he saw him as, one of the few Neoplatonists who truly understood it, who understood that there is a limit to knowledge, there's a limit to intellect, that ritual and practice and piety and a deep reverence for the gods and an openness to the world and the cosmos are just as integral, if not more, than all the contemplation and the intellectual exercises that others would be just playing with these words. And, one of them, Empedocles survives in a very convoluted, interesting way. But you can see there's a pseudo-Empedocles manuscript that was translated to Arabic, and it preserves many of his notions, particularly of this idea of two cosmic forces. You have, philia, you have love, and then you have neko, which is like this strife. And this nekos and philia is this dynamic exchange that happens simultaneously at the same time, but on varying degrees, depending on a multitude of factors that all magical systems you can understand as this creative binding and unloosening, this strife and love and this interplay of the two. And of course, as practitioners, you will both be very well aware of, the katadesmoi and this idea that, when you're making a charm or you're doing some sort of incantation or spell, you are, in a sense, binding. And to have the power to bind means you also have the power to release. And that is a power that the magician is privy to and utilizes. And we all utilize it to a certain degree, but only if we're aware of it and conscious of it. And so the Arabic alchemists are also very interesting because they're getting a lot of interesting. It's such a convoluted, such a complex history, where you have Democritus, who is learning from Bolos of Mendes, and they're writing sort of pseudo alchemical manuscripts, and there's this Persian influence as well, and Egyptian influence, and then you have Zosimos of Panopolis, and all of these different sort of Near Eastern influences are coming into play and combining and melding with the Hellenic, Greek. And if you just dive into alchemy, you know, particularly Arabic alchemy, which is heavily indebted to, you know, Aristotle and Aristotle's conception of the world and of nature, and physis, you start to, it's very difficult to penetrate. And so I felt myself, in order to get there, in order to understand it a little bit better, I needed to go back. I needed to go back even before Plato to Empedocles and to understand, how does a quote unquote pre-Socratic, how do they understand their world? How do the Greek physiologists understand their world? And so that was the pathway to open oneself up away from just purely intellectual, conceptual abstractions, but open oneself up to the world as a dynamic world soul, as a dynamic being that lives and breathes. And it really opened up a magical way of thinking. And this is the people that we consider, you know, academics consider like the first empiricists, you know, the first, you know, geographers, the first physiologists, because this was a time, this is like the, you know, this was before classical Greece, right? This was very archaic. This was the time when science and mythology were intermingled. And in a way, that's, I think, the most powerful form of science that we have, because it doesn't just speak to the mind or the body. It shows that the body itself is divine, that all things in the universe and the cosmos are divine. And alchemy cannot be understood ultimately without that first notion of how your body and the world around you are not separated in some object subject, you know, Cartesian dualism, that fundamentally everything flows inside one another, through one another, because this boundary that we think of ourselves and our bodies is incredibly permeable. And understanding how the body itself and its processes echo nature's processes out there, if we can use that word, out there, because we are part of nature, of course, right? And so when when you make that link, when you start delving into the way they understood their senses, you know, the way they understood incense, like we were just saying, and the olfaction, and this idea that, you know, there is this pneumatic sort of airy substance that is an echo of the god's presence. In fact, it is the instantiation of the god on a certain level. Then you realize that there's nothing that an alchemist does that's purely material. Of course, there are material alchemists. Of course, there are those who are, you know, what do they call them? What do they call them? Puffers or blowers? Those that, you know, the sort of seen as alchemists who are just looking for material gold for profit and wealth and power. But alchemy itself, in my opinion, I couldn't understand any aspect of it if not for this mindset that didn't lend itself to a separation or a divide between the inside and the outside.
Oh my gosh, I have so many. Yes,
you have so many questions. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, no, I that resonates completely with me.
I've actually,
wow.
Yeah. So there's this kind of trend with alchemy where it gets psychologized. It comes from you know, the Jungian camps, like Marie-Louise Franz, and I see it perpetuated by psychology, depth psychologists. But something I've been noticing with the opening up of the study of Islamic occultism and esotericism within academia, I see the academics there still psychologizing it, even if they're not psychologists. And so I want to get your perspective. So the way that I want to get your perspective on the psychologizing alchemy, and you know, there's this tendency for the world to just say, oh, alchemy is just proto-psychology, and tie it in a bow and say that's that, where it's stripping the magic from from alchemy itself, right?
Right.
Yeah. So where's your where do you lie on this?
Yeah. Another small question. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we can like partly, I think the scholarly sort of consensus there is this idea that you can put a lot of the fault towards Carl Jung, for psychologization. And this is again another thing, not to beat down those poor perennialists and traditionalists, but they often in their works, it was there's always one chapter dedicated, or at least like mentioned, where they talk about Jung and psychoanalytic theory as a psychologization of these, the sacred work. I think for Jung, it's slightly complex. I think I can understand where, the fruits of your labors, it's so much is the error falls in your students, people who've interpreted your works or misinterpreted your works more appropriately. I think Jung himself was a mystic. I don't think necessarily if you take Jung, at face, like at what he was doing himself knowingly, I don't think you can accuse Jung in particular of psychologization, because for him, and this is something that Kingsley talks about, for him the psyche is divine. The psyche is not merely the psyche. It's not merely psychological. And I think this is where a lot of people get hung up. They think that when we speak on the realm of the psychological, that we're merely talking about the epiphenomena of biological, neurological processes. And there is another sense of Psyche, right? Psyche is like that cold breath in the earlier conceptions. The Homeric conception is like this cold breath that leaves the body. It's the last dying exhalation before the soul passes in that last pneuma, right? But it's a soul. The Psyche is a soul. And so when we think about something on a psychological level, we're ultimately saying that in a level of analysis that we're looking at something is at the level of the soul. So to me, even though, don't get me wrong, I totally understand what we mean when we're saying psychologization. We are assuming again that you are saying it's a nothing but, that it's, this magical experience is a nothing but it fails to account for the fact that what we mean by psyche is very different than what a secular person means by the psyche. And I think as long as we have that in mind, we can say that alchemy, there's an element of alchemy that is interpreted and understood as having its effects on the level of the psyche. In that way, we can understand that in a level of analysis to be the psychological. Again, that wouldn't be the only realm in which alchemy would apply. It's, again, from a theurgic perspective, we're not just working on our souls, we're working on multiple planes of being. And so, the soul is one aspect of it. But in terms of alchemy, the way I see alchemy generally is this idea of a purification of a science of transmutation and transformation, which I think you would totally see in any form of alchemy that we encounter. And so I think there is an element there that's deeply misunderstood, like you were saying. And you're still working with material substances, you're still working with symbols. Again, these things occur at the level of the psyche. It is fundamentally psychological, but also you have to realize that the psychological is the cosmological. There is no work that is done in theurgy without a common understanding that when you are working on yourself, you're working on the world around you. When you are seeking self-knowledge of your soul, you are learning about the gods. When you're learning about the gods, you're learning about yourself. Again, it's non-dualistic. And again, I don't even like that term that's bandied around when people talk about non-dualism. I find I think people tend to misunderstand in many ways non-dualism, but again, it is non-dualist in its purest sense. Yeah, so I'll just stop right there.
Yeah, that's
That's great. I'm really enjoying this.
Yes,
This
no,
is great
100%.
answers.
Yeah.
I love it.
So would you say the practitioner is changed, or does reality change around the practitioner in this sense? Like, are we creating our own reality here by working on the self and the psyche?
I think what we're doing is we're aligning our own psyche with the way the world truly is. I think there is a sense in which there's a danger in which you can create, we sometimes we talk about demiurgy, right? And sort of like this world and cosmification and the creation and co-creators with the divine. But again, I think you can, what is that Milton? There's that like Milton quote, right? Like the mind can create a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. We have the power to do that. But again, the world that we are inhabiting and we're creating, we have to inhabit it. And sometimes we can create hells. And so it's that power has to be grounded in something that exceeds it, that is beyond it, and ultimately derives from some place that's virtuous, some place that is good. That goodness is the cosmos itself. The cosmos is good, as much as difficult as it is sometimes every day to tell ourselves that and to experience it and feel it, right? But again, the cosmos is good. There's no such thing as a kako cosmos. There's no evil cosmos, because ordering itself, the establishment of the cosmos, is inherently, the Greek word cosmos inherently also implies an arrangement and an ordering, but it also denotes something that's beautiful, and that's critical to the idea of a cosmos. It's a beautiful ordering. It's a beautiful arrangement. So when we as theurgists are, we are purifying ourselves, we are allowing ourselves a sense of release. We're using our powers, but we're also allowing ourselves to be passive in a sense, not always active. There's Yamlikus talks about udenia, which is this idea of like a nothingness, a knowing of one's own nothingness. And, it's related to this idea of like an emptying out of the ego, of everything you hold, all the constructs, all the concepts, all the egoic structures. Again, you're creating a vessel, and that vessel is to be imprinted and to be poured in. And again, alchemy has that idea of chemia. And, so even with Arabic, is like iksir is like this like fluid, right? So you have elixir is like elixir. It's this idea of something that is poured in, something that is poured into a vessel, and it has to be an empty vessel, because there was this one, I don't remember, it's probably some Chinese sage, or probably even Bruce Lee, who knows, it was probably Bruce Lee. He had this one story that he would tell, and this young man is talking to a master, and they're sitting in a tea house, and the young man is just going on and on about this and that, and all the busy nothings of his everyday life and his worries and his concerns. And meanwhile, the master is pouring green tea into a little cup, and then all of a sudden the cup starts to overflow, and the tea is pouring out into the table, and the young man is startled for a moment, stops in his speech and looks at his master, says, stop, what are you doing? Like, enough. Like, can't you see it's overflowing? And of course the master says, yes, that's exactly right. And he puts the tea back down on the table, and the student understands. You cannot overflow your cup. You cannot concern yourselves with the mindlessness of the everyday. It's an emptying. You need to empty your vessel for something greater and more divine to enter it. And I think the Theurgist does this well, because they understand that homoiosis, this idea of like participating in a way in the divine and acting in a way that is similar to the divine, echoing its movements and its energies and its actions and its virtues, is the goal. It's not as active as we would understand it to be. And all of those ritual things, all those purifications, all of those are sort of an exercise upon your own soul to condition yourself. So Proclus talks about sunharmosis. Sunharmosis is something that you do the work prior to henosis. Everyone talks about henosis. They all want to get straight to the final culminating point of theurgy, union with the one, right? Which is ultimately what henosis is. But nobody, very few people, I'm excluding us from this condemnation, my friends. Everyone wants to jump to the highest mode of union, and this sort of sunharmosis Proclus talks about. This is the calibration that we talked about at the beginning. This is this harmonization between all the different energies and activities of the soul, where we're forming virtue, where we're forming the synthemata, we're even looking at the planetary powers, and we're aligning our lives with them. And Iamblichus says this, like, this union with the ultimate divine, this let's say, when I say ultimate divine, I don't mean a god of gods, but the one of each god. But that ultimate henosis is only afforded to a few people after much practice, much effort. And so it's not exactly something that, it's not, as you're well aware, it's not something done half-ass. I'm looking at your place, and I'm looking at, the way you present yourselves. Like, this is a life. You are living this life. It is commitment. It is an absolute surrender to this way of being. This isn't a half-assed, lukewarm, dabbling your toes in something magical just to while away the afternoon. Again, this is a profound change in one's relationship to the cosmos and to the gods. And it's not for everyone. It's not meant to be for everyone. So there is a sense of ardor. There's a sense of also a difficulty. There's a reason why Theurgists were called athletes of fire, because it's an agon. It's a struggle, and it only takes someone who is almost an athlete in a spiritual sense, who will struggle and endure the hardships, who will be able to have that culminating experience that is really ultimately not really an experience. It's an experience that's not an experience.
So I don't even wow.
Yes.
Yeah, I have no words. Everything you're saying is, you have no idea how on point what you're talking about is from today, what we did today for our
exactly. Our live stream that we just came out of. Yeah.
Today was about exactly this. About how to
tell me about it.
Well, it was a little bit of a ride the tiger Sekhmet kind of thing. We stay away from politics, news, social issues, because to us there's nothing spiritual in that, as a distraction. However, the people that join the live stream obviously are stressed out by current events, and so we kind of gave him a little bit of talking about how, the best thing to do isn't inaction, but it's also not to engage. It's to turn around and ride the tiger, let it happen, and stand in the fire and the distraction. Only a few people, people called to the spiritual path will be able to be molded by this, and those who are molded by it are at an advantage over, let's say, a Buddha from the past age or whatever it is, because they had the opportunity to be molded by the Kali Yuga, however much weight you put into that. So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's just funny.
It's
You
just,
know how this works. It's synchronicity.
It's weird.
Everything kind of like aligns on the same topic and the same theme.
And also the struggle is real too, because it is when you do, surrender yourself to this path, you lose a lot of people, and you have, and you have to restructure a lot, because, your growth forward is not, people maybe around you are not in alignment with that. And it's not it is hard. Yeah, definitely. But it's definitely worth it, because gosh, like when I finally did that, my life's been so much more, cohesive, easy than the struggles previous, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, you go through a lot of suffering and a world of pain and
feeling like what is going on
until you finally get it, and you learn like, oh, all I have to do is empty myself, surrender, and let let it come, and then all of a sudden, as you're saying, the Milton quote, all of a sudden your hell becomes heaven.
Yes.
It's like, what are you talking about? My world's not on fire. Maybe yours is, but
Yes. And what was the difference? How you thought about it and how you acted.
It's like the acceptance, the surrender, the emptying of the vessel. I think there's this excerpt from the Enneads with Plotinus that I'm always thinking about in terms of that vessel, because trying to go into that state of reception, I place a lot of importance in operative magic, right? So a lot of the 19th century derivative magicians, they'll tell you that it's all about enacting will and that kind of stuff. And so if you talk about, you want to be receptive and you want to, surrender your will to the highest will and receive it, and that's how good magic happens. They'll give you funny looks. They're like, what are you talking about?
Right.
But I think about, from the Enneads, Plotinus, he talks about the mirror. He's talking about the soul, and he's talking about that mirror needs to be cleaned so that it can harness the image, that it can reflect the image. Because if the mirror is not there, then the image is not there, right? And that's like, if you're bringing down the image of the deity or the magic or whatever,
the observer effect,
the soul has to be the mirror in order to, it has to receive what you're calling down, right?
And it's amazing to me how these ancient people knew about these concepts that we now just recently have discovered, quote unquote, obviously rediscovered. Like that. That's the observer effect, right? If it's no one's there to observe it, it doesn't exist. Which is if the mirror is dirty and it can't be seen. It's not happening.
Or it's distorted, that kind of thing.
Very interesting to me.
The polishing of the mirror is very important. Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. But absolutely. I think, like, to go back to sort of even with the idea, like, I think there's the idea even with alchemy, in a way, like, what you are doing is redeeming the world from its darkness. You're extracting the source, the divine spark within it, that light hidden within almost the impenetrable darkness of matter. And you are essentially allowing it to be given birth. You're birthing it. You're allowing it to come through you as a vessel. And it's interesting because, if you read some of the Neoplatonists, you have this somehow a sense in terms of the cosmic structure of things that, here we are descended in the material world, and it's dark, and it's, it's evil, and it's terrible, and, this is the lowest kind of, the lowest place of manifestation, right, from, the ultimate one, supreme divine, or however you want to phrase it. But again, the human is not at the end point. We are not in a polar opposition towards the gods. We are fundamentally in the center of the universe. The human being, is in the center of the cosmos. There are things that are inferior, quote unquote. I'm not using this term ethically or, moralistic. There are things that are below us in the cosmogenesis, like animals, like plants, like rocks, like gemstones. And in a way, what's very strange is that the highest of the high, the one, let's call it in this regard, or the henads of the gods, that kind of, collectively in a polycentric manner, kind of like, derive and in turn help. Well, I didn't even have the language to express it properly, but the one is the highest part of each god as a god. And in its relation with all the other gods, it forms this unitive or unifying structure. So anyway, let's not go there. But on the other end of things is matter, which is the receptacle, the hupadoke. And so nothing could happen in cosmogenesis. Nothing could unfold in the cosmos. The God's project itself could not manifest and create the world that we inhabit if it wasn't for the receptacle on the other end. And in a way, all things emerge from the gods, but the idea is that matter itself is this all-receiving thing that is, it always receives the imprints of the forms, but it's never exhausted by it. There's always a lack, and that's kind of this idea of matter as evil. There's always a lack. There's always a desiring. There's always room for more in terms of generation. But ultimately, human beings are in the middle of these two cosmic poles. And as you move from very simple, the gods are considered simple in terms of their activity. Their activities are simple. Obviously, as they manifest downwards, it increases in complexity. And the height of the culmination of complexity of powers is within the human being. The human being is alchemically, if you want to think about it, or even through Empedocles' understanding, and this is Abamon, this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying how the root of a lot of these alchemical traditions I see formulated mystically in Empedocles' understanding of the cosmos. Those four rhizomata, those four roots of the earth, like the fire, earth, air, and water. Again, humans are the perfect, around our heart is the perfect ratio of all those four elements. And that's what allows us to cognize our consciousness, essentially, is an element of this. This is how our consciousness is formed. It's through the movement of the blood around the heart. And these four elements comprise that sort of movement around the heart. So we are at the height of complexity in terms of all the powers that impact us every single day. I'm hungry, I have sexual urges today. Oh, look, there's a squirrel outside my window. All of these things are grasping for our attention, distracting us, pulling us every which way because of the complexity of the powers that we contain within us, because ultimately they do come from the gods as they're emanating outwards. But then, interestingly enough, there's a power that's always unrecognized, because that's the power of the material realm. That's the power of another goddess. That's the power that gives room and allows manifestation to move into its space without being ultimately affected by that space. And as you move towards animals and plants and stones, you're descending in increasingly simple constructions. A stone is much more simple than a dog. So in essence, what we have is a cosmos where the highest realm is incredibly simple, the realm of the gods. And then at the way bottom extreme is also absolute simplicity, and that is matter in its most primordial form. And in between, we have the highest level of complexity, which is the human being. And in this way, we can give birth, we can create cosmoi, we can create statues, we can create these algamata, right? We can imbue a statue with life. We can put herbs that are sympathetic. We can burn incense that is sympathetic to a particular deity or an astrological, planet. And we can imbue it even by allowing this statue to come to life, to be embodied, emsuchos, or emsuchosis, this embodied with the spirit. You're inspiriting a material statue, and that becomes an instantiation of the god. And so we can give birth to these things. And that's part of what we're in the Hermetic books, in the Hermetic treatises. This is kind of what we're being called to do, to give birth in beauty, to actually create beautiful things, to bring joy and light and life into the world. And the world that we're currently inhabiting, not to get political, is the opposite. And as horrific as the world is, the state of the world is, I used to, I'm going to finish my thought. As horrific as the world is, it's not, well, there is a redeeming aspect to it, is how I should end this. But I used to get quite upset, and I'm trying to remember, was it Jung or was it Kingsley? Anyway, one of the two. And in the sense, he didn't say that it's necessarily our fault, but it is an abnegation of our duties. And it sounds unfair. And I always thought it sounded unfair until I sat with it and thought about it. There is a way in which the world has become titanic. And there are many of us, I'm sure you both included, who are doing what you can to reorder it, to stabilize it, to allow that moth to come forth, to purify it, to purify our psychic energies, our disturbances, our soul's imbalances, and you do an excellent job of that. That's your wonderful sort of path in this world. But I think in a way we've all failed. I feel like in a way the world itself is not evil. It is allowed for evil because we haven't done the work. People haven't done the work. And, this is, again, you fall into this mass, unconsciousness. And that's how evil comes into play. And I don't use evil in necessarily that biblical understanding or, necessarily in that regard. I take it from a Neoplatonic perspective of evil. But in a really manifest way, the establishment of that Ma'at and that order hasn't been done. And I don't think we're at the scale where we can do much about it. And I understand the idea of riding the tiger. And that's kind of how I see it in many ways. That's all that's kind of left to us. We can do what we can in certain pockets, but I think the system, the cosmos, the way it's arranged now, the powers and forces of degeneration are at such a point where we have to ride this along to the end, but do the best that we can to maintain a semblance of sanity in it, which for many people is insanity, but that's a completely different approach.
100%. Yes. That's what we were just talking about.
I got to say or you're talking about the matter and form and matter receiving form. We were literally just talking, I think last week, or maybe it was a few weeks ago on one of the live streams, we were trying to explain Abu Lafia, how he assigns Adam and Eve to form and matter, with Eve being matter or whatever. But even going towards that, I think like beyond that, and then what you were saying about, there are redeeming qualities of the world. I think
so beautiful place.
Yes, exactly. We were up at Mount Shasta over the summer, and it was the middle of the night. We were doing a ritual up on a hilltop, and you can see the huge mountain, full moon, and just the dark forest. And I just looked at her as like, this is why I don't believe in an evil demiurge like this.
Yeah.
No way.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, or when we're in Sedona, getting married, and like the scenery is so beautiful, yet everybody's on their phones. And
oh my gosh,
overwhelmingly beautiful, right? Like it almost brings tears. So of course this place is still beautiful. It's the actors within it that's the issue.
I mean, there's only so much you could do about that, and just kind of
you got to focus on what you can do.
Focus on what you can control, exactly,
and do the good work you can. And hopefully that radiates outward.
And it's like,
so I'm actually pretty unfamiliar. Like you said a difference between a biblical evil and a Neoplatonic evil. Let's go a little bit into that. So as a Neoplatonic, I myself personally, I think this is where I get a little modern. I'm a bit of a relativist. So like you're talking about an ontological evil, or you're talking about like an evil that is the absence, or or what is this?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I agree. I'm very much with you there on the abhorrence to the idea of like a demiurge, an evil demiurge. That type of Sethian Gnostic excess. Again, I understand where it's coming from. Like, I listen to some people and, they think we live in a matrix thing and everything's like, it's not a real reality. It's all computer generated type of, fake constructs. We're in a computer somewhere. I don't know. And then this idea it's an existential position. It's an absolute feeling of alienation. And like, that's natural. That's natural to feel alienation in a world. And in fact, that's a great instigator for theurgy. That's a great way it's a good thing to feel at the beginning. So you start on the path. But evil, again, what I mean by like Neoplatonic conception of evil, Proclus describes evil not necessarily in the sense of like how the Orthodox Christians would view evil as or the Catholics, what is it, privatio boni, this idea of like it's the absence of the good. Evil is what they calls a parhypostasis. It's it's essentially a byproduct of good, of goodness, of an ordering. It's fundamentally, it is something that is, in a way, it is an uncaused cause. It's parasitic, essentially, is the way to describe it. So evil exists, not maybe in the strictly ontological sense, where you have like an evil demon running around or running around, or an evil demiurge that's hell-bent on torturing and all that.
Are you still there, Abbas?
Wait, sorry.
You're roboting out.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, there
yes.
you go. There you go. So the
course, the
last
moment
thing
I-
that you said was evil in an
Demon.
ontological sense.
Yeah.
Of course, the moment I start talking about evil, I have technical issues. That's great.
That's how it works.
That's how it works.
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah. So evil is ultimately parasitic. It's parasitic on the good. When we talked about the cosmos is an arrangement of ordered parts that comprises a whole. Everything functions in its appropriateness. It has a sense of justice because it has a place that's allotted to it. It has timai, it has honors. All of these things can be understood as construing like a very complicated system. But there's something that happens at the level of human beings, or partial. What we are partial beings. We are parts of a whole, and the idea is that when you're at the level of partial being, that's when you don't have the full experience and the full realization of the past, the present, and the future. And in a way, it's a byproduct. Evil is a byproduct of our very limited natures, our partial beings. For the gods, what they will happens right away. Their willing and their doing or their acting is immediate, and they can only will the good. So this is a deep Platonic tenet where a god, despite, sometimes the language that's used in Homer or Hesiod, like, I can't think of an immediate sort of understanding, but like even the idea, which sounds very strange, I guess, to people who are familiar with mythology, but even Typhon is not evil. Or the Chthonian dogs in the Chaldean oracles that will inhabit one's vessel and drag one back down to the material realm. They're not technically speaking evil. And again, I think that speaks to your point about relativism. They're evil in relation to the goal of theurgy, which is ultimately union or workings of the divine that you're trying to embody. But the thing is, the Chthonian dogs are allotted a space within the cosmos. In that sense, there is a sense of orderedness and goodness. With Typhon, the battle with Typhon that Zeus encounters with. This is a different arrangement. This is a different ordering of the cosmos. It's almost a complete other. It is like a complete arrangement that is a total antipathy to the ordered arrangement of Zeus that we would inhabit. So in that sense, you can understand it as evil, but in itself, it is good. In its own strange, serpentine, very, destructive sense, it is good as a god. But the manner of sort of establishing that order would not be good for the human being. That's one aspect of it. But the idea of the evil is that it is fundamentally something that, through our inability to have the comprehension of the gods and the knowledge of the gods and the willing of the gods, something is allowed to enter, something that is not foreseeable by us. So something could be considered evil, let's say, I don't know, I can give an example, like, you turn on the oven because you want to bake some cookies, and then you leave it and the house burns down, and, this whole family, something horrible happens to it. Like, in a sense, you can say that's evil, but in another regard, it is a characteristic of a limited human being, of a partial being that doesn't understand the entire plan and the entire sort of noetic conception of that the gods possess. And so that's more of a Neoplatonic understanding. It's parasitical on an established order that's already by definition good, because the evil is not productive of something that establishes an order. That's why, when Ray, descends to the Amduat, he's always battling Apophis, the chaotic, malevolent, embodiment of all those things that are completely averse and completely in opposition to his established order. But ultimately, there is no sense in which Apophis is victorious. There's always the risk, but it's never actualized, because the sun always rises and order is reestablished. And in many regards, you can see that, with ancient Egypt, at some point, maybe the order could not continue as it was manifested through the Egyptian sort of practice and theology. The civilization kind of went into retreat based on Hermes' prophecies. But that's what are your thoughts on? I don't want to just keep on laboring on. What are your thoughts on evil?
Evil, yeah. I mean, I'm personally a Hermetic Abrahamist. However, I obviously, being an occultist, I'm not institutionally coherent. So I do not believe in the ontological evil. It's a relativism. It's a matter of perspective, and it's exactly what you're talking about, where it's like you don't know what the plan is. I'm a lot more aligned with the Kabbalists, which is when you're talking about the necessity of evil as a part of the act of creation or whatever, when you're taking it from an Abrahamic view. The Kabbalists talk about this, but I mean, there's the argument that Kabbalah is just Neoplatonism for Jews, but so it's I'm definitely like really in line with the relativism, and it's funny because I prefer to practice classically and up until the medieval period. However, I do have those funny little parts of my philosophy, like relativism, moral relativism, that are just so postmodern, it's painful. But I think it's just a product. I personally don't like to subscribe to a school. I think this is something like when we're learning for ourselves. Like you get to a point, you start and you're like, okay, I'm starting with this school of thought. Because I need a direction to go in. Yeah. But then as you progress on your spiritual journey, you have these experiences and you learn what works for you. And then these neat little boxes, they start to fall apart, and you can't like necessarily say like, oh, this is where I'm at, Absolutely. Because really at the end of the day, I mean, the you were saying earlier that the philosophers are doing wordplay. The reality of the situation is I'm at a point in my personal experience within magic and the occult as causality is I'm starting to question if cause and effect is even a thing, right? Like, it's,
right.
but, yeah, like when a spell works, when you have a mystical experience, you have a hard time pinpointing when it began and when it ended,
yes.
right? And
Every time.
yeah,
of course.
it's crazy. And so I just
it's hard because we're constantly bombarded with real, what's supposed to be real.
What's real.
And,
exactly.
We're indoctrinated into that. And then our experience tells us otherwise. Right. It's a challenge.
I think that the only Eastern practice I really got into was sleep and dream yoga. And that the whole point of that is, you don't know what real is, that what is the line between sleep, dream, and awake?
Well, now they're saying that there isn't one.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about your perspectives on this, because this is something I had to contend with, but I'm sure every magical practitioner also has to contend with. So we're talking about almost altering this, this conventional, received understanding of the way the world works and how it operates and what it inhabits it. And Dr. Stone, you were just referring to that. So a lot of that's conditioned by our upbringing and our education. So how, I don't know anything about how both of you were raised and what type of environment and, whether such spiritual matters were discussed at home or believed in, but how does it feel when you start to see things with clearer eyes and starting to see realities that most people are completely oblivious to, or they explain away? How does things start to change? Right?
Yeah.
The way you inhabit the world changes and you start to make connections between things. And of course, there's a danger to that. But how do you deal with the strange happenings that you start to notice psychologically? Like from this is related to this idea of also obsessive compulsive disorders or people who have anxiety disorders. Like when they open up this door, they're ultimately going to start experiencing things. And so what guidance do you have? How did you experience that? Like when you first were opening up yourselves to this reality?
We both went crazy at first.
I have the biannual existential crisis that usually coincides with initiation.
I'm constantly going, oh my God. Yeah. All the time.
I had an experience. I mostly work with Jinn and out of the Picatrix and that kind of place, right? I've had plenty weird experiences that range from straight up paranormal, stuff's moving, that kind of stuff, to the occult magic experiences where it's like what's going on. And without fail, there's always something that deeply psychologically unsettles me.
Destabilizing.
The most recent experience was she's a medium and I'm a conjurer, and so we work together in that kind of classic kind of dynamic.
I wasn't sure for sure.
And she was pulling, she doesn't know about the Arabic tradition. She was pulling the descriptions of the jinn, like what they look like. She was pulling them, and then she was getting these sigils from these spirits. I'm writing them down in my grimoire, and I think 6 months into it, we're doing these experiments and something clicks in my mind, pull up a star map, and I start overlaying the sigils on the star map, and they're minor Arabic indicator stars that they look like constellations. The sigils line up perfectly, and the indicator stars are in the exact position in the sky that you had to conjure that jinn in. Yeah. And it was one of those things where I felt like the stars were laughing at me, and the universe was like, "What do you think this is? You think this is a joke?"
So I'm thinking I'm just making up stuff, like it's just my imagination, because I know absolutely squat about any of this. This is not what I studied. It's not what I practiced at all, and I have zero information about it. And I go into it totally blind, and then I'm telling him this stuff that I'm getting, and then it ends up being something for real. That's crazy to me. And it was hard. I actually went so much so that I got a psych evaluation done at USC, or it took 2 weeks because I'm such I was a research scientist for the government for 20 years when I was a bit younger. And so everything's rooted for me in science, right, originally. And even though I was having crazy experiences, and I went to science precisely for that reason, because it was a way for me to kind of shield myself from these things that were happening ever since I was a kid that I couldn't explain, that didn't match with what I'm taught is real. So science was helpful in that regard for a period, of time. But at some point you become so experienced in science that you start to meet other scientists that are very much so in the school of thought of, this can't all be by accident, this has to be something else. And they start to go in the other direction personally with their belief systems. And that was surprising to me, but so when I had to have some evidence that I wasn't insane before I could even entertain the idea that there was something else going on. So I had that done. And sure enough, there's, I don't have schizophrenia. I don't have anything like that. So then that left me with, okay, now what? And then starting to work with him, like, it's just like, what? How is this possible?
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's really, it's still
the amount of years, and that you always have that experience where it feels like the universe is just kind of like mocking you, like, oh, you think you've got it figured out.
Well, you don't. Yeah. You never do.
Exactly.
And every time you think you have something, it just lends itself to another rabbit hole to go down to discover more stuff. I don't believe it's ever ending.
Yeah, I think like the more paranormal stuff, like when something moves or you hear a sound or you hear a knock,
I'm not gonna lie.
She gets scared. I'm a little impervious to that, because I'm kind of at the point where I'm just like, okay, that, like, there's nothing that can happen, right? Like, nothing bad's going to happen. Right. I don't even know what it is. It could be a possum for all I know. Right? Okay. So that doesn't shake me. I think what really shakes me is when those like weird synchronicities where it seems a causal and it triggers an existential thing, right?
It does.
But
like, how would I
it's like, it's happened so much. It used to really derail me. And
it's not so much anymore.
Now I lean more into like acceptance and faith, and especially dealing with spirits the way that I deal with. That can really mess with my head, because you're always, as an Abrahamist, you're always like wondering, like, am I being misled? Like, where's this heading? Yeah. And then the cure to that.
How do you know that? How do you know the cure?
Well, the discernment of spirits is something that the the Christian mystics deal with a lot. So I take a lot of inspiration from them, and you're basically looking at like how your soul is predisposed, right? So you have to know where your soul is predisposed, right? So if you are a pious man, then that is where your soul is predisposed. And then when you're interfacing with the spirit, how does the spirit make your soul feel? What kind of movement is it causing? And if the movement is dissonant, then you know that is in a different direction, right? So let's say you're a pious man, you're interfacing with the spirit, and you feel that dissonance. You know that spirit is working towards something that the pious man doesn't. On the other end of the spectrum, let's say that you are a goeticist and you are doing magic because you want money and power, and you come into contact with a demon and you feel a harmony to it. Well, that's because that's where your soul is predisposed, right? But I think like really leaning into faith and acceptance has helped me when I hit those existential crises a lot. I just kind of like let go, like a let go, let God kind of thing. Like, you know what? I was called to magic. I do magic. It works for me. There's a reason. And, I'm not afraid of going to some fiery lake.
Oh, okay. Well, I was.
When I die, I think that's absolutely ridiculous. I always tell people that, I've already been to hell, like, there's no hell God can send me to that's worse than the one I put myself through.
That's true.
Yeah. So,
that's true. I mean, so for me, I was raised very Southern Baptist, which is crazy, very hardcore religious, like kind of evangelical vibe. Yeah. But I didn't like it. As soon as I was 8 years old, I remember I saw the hypocrisy and I said something about it, and I got a beating for it and became the scapegoat of my family at that moment. And that's all fine. But when my whole life practicing, like reading tarot and stuff like that, from when I was 12, I've been doing this for 35 years now. I still had this little minute, like, what if they're right? Kind of just this kind of concern about hell or whatever, because I get told that. We get told that on our channel all the time too. Like, I got called a soulless ginger the other day by somebody.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. And so, or I'm going to hell, whatever. But when I died, that's not what happened. And And so that, like, the best experience I've ever had that helps me integrate all of this stuff is that experience, obviously, which I'm aware most people aren't going to have. I never thought I would have it. And it totally changed how I view and how I walk in this like body. You know, I'm just a totally different person now. I understand things differently than I did before that absolutely didn't mesh with what I believed to be true. Honestly, I was kind of you die and that's it. We're done. So I didn't expect anything like what happened. And there was no religious, stuff going on, but there was stuff going on. And so when I have these moments where I get concerned or like a little bit freaked out, I just remember when I was not here anymore and think about how I was able to see the big picture. Like, because in that moment I could see past, present, future all at once. And it wasn't separate from itself. It just was. I don't know how else to put that. And there was no separate, even though I was looking at a version of me that looked a bit different from me, I was aware that that was me. And even though it's out there, it's still me. It's really hard I don't have language for it. But it's this idea that, it is all one thing at some level. And I love what you said about it being simple, because I say this often. It's like one of the things I say to my students, or, especially when they're like cheating on papers or whatever, is, we complicate things like so much as humans. Like sometimes the solution is just simple. And when we're told that as an option, we immediately reject it because we are so complicated and complex, right? That a simple solution can't be it. But in reality, that is what it is. And it's not simple for the mere fact that we can't view it as worthy of an attempt because it's too simple. Does that make sense? And so when you were saying about how it comes from the simple on both sides and then in the middle it's complex, I was like, I completely understand what you mean by that, because in my experience, that is true. But I just remind myself that, science has been wrong many times. There's been people that have discovered things somehow unknowingly that ended up being accurate, and were unalived for it at the time, and then posthumously like hailed as, these great thinkers or discoverers.
Then they were canonized.
Yes. And so the idea that right now we just have all the sum total of all the possible knowledge or things that could be is ludicrous to me. And
yes, of course,
that we haven't been able to learn how to measure it properly yet. That's all. It's just we haven't discovered a way to quantify it as science needs. I don't know that science will ever be able to fulfill that in this regard. Maybe it shouldn't, but you know what I mean? I perhaps there is a aspect of faith that is needed in order to align oneself properly. Because if we were just told it outright, there would be no challenge there, right? There would be no struggle. We would just have the information and that would be it. So I do believe that maybe that's why it's a bit shielded or occulted, right?
Yeah, the word faith, it seems to be a dirty word in these circles just because it's linked with
religion,
Christianity or whatever. But it's honestly, I feel, is one of the greatest tools of somebody that does magic. And it's all over the Solomonic tradition. It's all over the exorcism manuals. It's like, look, like you can only do this if you have the utmost faith, right?
In yourself.
And faith, it simply comes down to, I trust that my creator, my God, has a plan for me. I trust that there is a plan, and I'm only worrying about the next indicated step. I'm not thinking ahead. I'm not letting the anxiety, the run. And that usually gets me through the psychological messes that happen on this path when you run into stuff.
Yeah. And I have a question though for you. Like who would you advise against practicing theurgy, if anyone?
Ooh.
We're gonna put some light.
Oh, there we go. We have light.
And Abamon said light.
I'm not sure. I think that's very good question. I think it's to each person individually. I think ultimately, I don't want to talk about a type of person. because it's easy for us to categorize types of people. Of course, those who have sinister, sort of power focused, like, soul power for manipulation and coercion. There are those types of psychotic and sociopathic people. But ultimately, it precludes those people just from the get-go, theurgy, because ultimately it does require a sense of faith, like you're saying. This pistis is the ancient Greek word for it. It requires a sense of piousness, and virtue. And this is all preliminary. It could be kind of like practiced and honed in as you're doing the theurgic rituals, but it's also necessary to have that as a foundation. And honestly, it would preclude people who would be unworthy of the art itself. So I think in that regard, it kind of it limits the pool of people who would be able to do it in a manner that would be authentic, I would say. But ultimately, it's an individual who has acknowledged their sympathy with a god and their eros and their love and their devotion to a god. There's a particular sense of a union of a henosis that is a one-to-one. I think it's like monos pro monon, which is this idea of like a one-to-one union that is the individuality of the human being or the worshiper with the particular existential individuality of the god to whom they are turning themselves toward in union. Proclus has, I'm not going to remember the exact quote, but he does say is like, for people who try to bring multiplicity in their union to the one will fail, essentially. You cannot unite with the one through all the multiplicity that resides within the soul. So there is a sense in which it is ultimately a one-to-one relationship. And I think as a theurgist, what you're doing is deepening the relationship with multiple deities, ones that you follow in the Platonic series. They have these serii, which are like processions, these chains. And at the head of these processions, there are certain gods, depending on what type of procession. And you find yourself having an affinity towards music, you might be following in the train of Apollo. If you're into beauty or proportion or a sense of seductiveness and allure, you might have an affinity with Aphrodite. And none of these are gendered necessarily, right? These are the soul's yearning and erotic desire up these causal chains, if you want to call it, or sympathetic chains, using the herbs, using the spices, using sort of tools and symbols, ineffable, articulations. These all evoke that ascent and help the theurgist along. So there is something very individual about it. But again, if you're coming at this practice without any sense of virtue, without any sense of piety, no pistis, you're seeing this as yet another tool to control the world around you, I think you'll find yourself adrift in very deep waters in theurgy and lost.
That's interesting that you're saying that when you have an affinity for one deity, because you can attest this too. Like there's one in particular that I work with often that I get like the results are immediate and even visible to other people. I've actually caught it on recording, which I would.
She is crazy like that.
I would love to send it to you. It's actually because it's in another language. I don't know what it's saying, but we were doing invocation of Hecate. I was leading it, and I don't know why I decided to do that. It wasn't even my group, but I just did it the last minute, and we got an actual recording of, and I wasn't even looking for that. It just, you can hear it. It comes on the wind, literally.
It sounds like Maynet's on the wind. They're speaking in Greek. It's
I think Greek.
One of the most incredible things.
That's amazing.
And it was, we were out in the middle of absolute nowhere. We'd hiked in like over a mile to get to where we were going out in the woods. And we got this. But like when I work with for other stuff, it's not so much. So
Yes.
that's interesting how you're saying that you have an affinity for one, because maybe that means something that I wasn't aware of previously. So thanks for that little nugget.
That's amazing. That's amazing. That's amazing. And
Yeah, I'll send it to you. You can listen. It's like I have a shortened clip of it where it's just right before it happens. It's only 30 seconds long, but if you happen to know what it's saying,
Yeah, I know. We
would
tried.
love.
Well,
I sent it
could
over
do my
to
best.
I sent it over to the Hellenic Reconstructionist Discord, and they couldn't figure out what I said. I was like, "Do none of you speak Greek?" Like,
Yeah, apparently not.
I realized they didn't.
That's fantastic.
It's multiple voices, and they're all like cackling almost.
Yeah,
it's very strange.
Wow.
It's funny because she likes to record rituals against all advice, and she catches stuff all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting here, and I'm like, why don't we record this? We were doing a ritual. She wanted to record a ritual that we did in the desert where I conjured a djinn, and I got it in the scrying crystal. I got a visual manifestation, and she caught it on tape. And I was like, why do we tell people not to record these?
I don't know. I go against the advice of most people. I'm a rebel.
I think they just like her because I don't think they let me do that.
I ask permission ahead of time, but I also know that they're going to give it to me. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So it's kind of like that, I guess. But that's interesting. I really appreciate that, because I've always wondered, like, for myself, am I just limiting myself by just working specifically with this one deity? No. But it's just been something that it's been in my life since I was little. Like, I didn't even know what it was as a kid, no clue. Yeah. But as I got older, I started to recognize it, and I was like, oh, geez. But I mean, visible, like even in the ritual room here, knocks, bangs, like all kinds of stuff, things moving. Yeah, as soon as I start, and it's always, it makes me feel good, actually.
Well, it's nice. Yeah, it's nice to have it contained in a certain place, and then you can definitely pick up, because it's contained in a certain place. Then the energy gets loaded into that room, and then when I walk into this room, I can tell when something's, like when I need to do purification, I can tell when something's visiting, that is, like has an affinity. And so a lot of activity happens in here, but previously when we didn't have a ritual room, when she lived in her own place, I lived in my own place, and it was the entire home. It just had a dirty vibe.
Yeah, it just felt like murky.
It was just like not good,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Oh, man, this has been so great.
Yeah, no, this is great, Abbas. I think we're gonna call it. We kept you a long time.
I know, sorry.
It's getting late.
I know.
So fascinating.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
You've been fantastic.
No.
Like,
it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure.
Everything you're saying was just, I 100% relate to it. So
no, cool. I just wanted to say, one thing is the Hecate thing. It's just like, I find it's beautiful because I find she's deeply misunderstood. I live in a log home in the woods, literally right beside a place where 3 roads meet. I'm not even kidding you. And it backs up into a marsh, and strangest things happen. But one night I have a particular affinity for Hecate myself as well. But the moon was a full moon, and it was so intense that you could see the shadows from the trees on the hills surrounding us. And it's that we have a lot of farmland and sort of like country rolling hills around us. And there was something there on that three-way road. And I've had that deepening relationship as well. But I also, Hecate, besides Hecate, is Helios as well. I have a particular affinity for, and many different, so it may not be one god. It could be multiple. Depending also on your natal chart, astrological chart, you can look at the different positions as well, and you could get a sense from there as well of where you have these sympathies and alignments. But yeah, it's a very magical experience to expose yourself to these types of I don't know. I don't see mythology. I don't see these things as simply just stories. These are embodied. These are real things. These are processes that have come down to us in narratives that function on multiple levels at once. And so I thank you both for like the time and for, having me on this channel, inviting me to talk about these things. And yeah, I hope at some point we could do it again. It was really a pleasure.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Abbas, and I really appreciate the personal story. That really, I love it when people are able to like share their personal experiences with these things. It just like it uplifts my heart. It makes me like a little teary eyed.
And your house sounds beautiful.
Yeah, I know. It sounds like
my
a
dream
perfect
home.
way for the work. Yes.
Yes. One day.
Yeah, one day. So anyways, thank you so much, Abbas. And for you guys listening at home, check out Abbas the Alchemist on YouTube. His channel is absolutely fantastic. And bring your notepads because he drops a lot of references and resources.
Of course.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah,
of course.
You so much.
All right, thank you, Abbas.
Blessings upon you both.
Yeah, we'll send you a link to that video, and if you have, it's 30 seconds.
I'd love to see it.
And let us know what you think.
Yeah, if you can figure out what it is.
Are we crazy or not?
I'm usually trying to debunk her.
Yeah, always. I'm
always like trying to debunk her. She's like, I got the ghost and that kind of stuff. And she showed it to me when she got back from the camping trip, and I'm just sitting there, I'm looking, and I'm like, yeah, it sounds like you got a like witch group from ancient Greece.
Literally.
I was like, I can't explain this.
It was literally right after I did the invocation. It was like just this rush of wind that comes, and all these animals start. There's literally no animals like that out there. There's noises of animals, and then like women, even a man. I think multiple voices just saying stuff. I have no idea what it is.
But there's a. I consider myself an Orphic as well, but there's this idea in Orphism where it's like the disembodied souls are fleeing in the wind, and on a particularly windy days is when you have the most activity. The anemoi is like the winds, but the anemoi is also related to animus, which is that enlivening spirit. And in a way, this is where the souls travel, those biathanatoi, those kind of like people who've experienced an untimely death. And Hecate especially could be associated with those people who've died before their time in a way. And the magician uses sometimes those very, certain intense and like very dark practices, but that's where the spirits are. That's where the souls are. They're in the air and the winds, so.
Yeah, we couldn't even separate it, right? Like you couldn't separate the sound.
Oh yeah, I tried to do forensic audio on it. I was an audio engineer in a past life. Tried to do some forensic audio on it and couldn't separate sound. But the winds thing it's something that I've been into recently, the past like year or two or whatever. I'm obsessed with the cardinal directions and the gates and how those work. I've been obsessed with it for like 5 years now. But the winds that pop up in the PGM and the working theory and my personal gnosis on spirit conjuration and spirits is that the reason that we call the winds and like the winds are what bring the spirits here, and it comes in through the north, and you can actually see that in the PGM. Like you could see the invocation of the winds in there, and people don't really realize that even in the Greek magical papyri, this thing that we think of like
calling the quarters,
pagan calling the quarters, like no, it's like right there, and they're calling the winds because they believe that the spirits came on the winds. Yeah,
that's crazy. Well, I'll send that over to you.
Wonderful.
Thanks so much. So nice to meet you.
You take care. Have a good night.
You too.
Bye-bye.
You too.
You've been listening to Discourse, where we venture into the mysteries of esotericism, the occult, and the depths of spiritual exploration. I am Abamon the Great, joined as always by Dr. Anna Stone, bringing adept insights to help guide your journey. Remember, the path of wisdom is illuminated by both knowledge and experience. Until next time, continue your exploration and stay attuned to the unseen.